In the last video, we took a detailed look at the effects section that we have in the editor tab for all of these different expansion pads where we can drag all these samples. And then we have independent control over things like EQ, compression, level, our general left and right stereo perspective balance, and a mid-side balance knob. In this video, what I wanted to do was start focusing on some of the functions in terms of the host and sync settings that we have within Regroover Pro. So let's go ahead here. Let's go back to our layers. I'm going to activate my kick. I'm going to activate my snare, and I'm going to activate my hi-hats. If you recall, in a previous video, we basically eliminated the need to have 4 layers, and we transferred all of the sonic information split up between these 3 layers over here. So this one doesn't really matter. Now, we also know already from previous videos that we can adjust these flags over here, these markers, on the individual layers so that they can play within a loop cycle. Now, for a lot of this video, I've been using the internal playback for any time that I'm adjusting things. So for example, if I was to engage playback right now from within this virtual instrument, I'll go ahead and do that. You can see here that we have the looped pattern playing of this whole drum pattern. Now, if I adjust this and make it different, and we'll have to do another adjustment over here. You can see that we can drastically affect the way that this pattern plays simply by dragging these markers. Now, I want to take a moment to talk about the different settings. So I currently have this set to host, which means that if I was to engage my playback from my DAW, that this would go ahead and this would engage the internal looping sequencer that we have set up based on these marker flags for each one of these layers. Before I do that, perhaps I'll just go ahead and mute this information over here. And let's go ahead and actually let's make our looping range the entire length of this whole MIDI event over here. We'll bring back our virtual instrument. Now I'll go ahead and play this. So, when we engage playback with the host mode set to on, essentially what's happening is Regroover Pro is using its internal sequencer and it's looping the content on these layers based upon these markers that we have set. If we wanted to make something completely different, a different pattern in terms of resequencing this pattern, we already know that we can go ahead and do that simply by adjusting these MIDI markers. Okay. So that's one way to look at this. And then in addition to the layer markers that we have, and another shortcut that we have is that we can actually use this grabber tool over here. If we want to move the cycle range, we want to keep it the same length, but move its position. Let's go ahead and let's just reset these back to the full range. And then we also know that based on this mode, host mode, that if we have any MIDI that we've programmed out, let's just go ahead and select everything over here and unmute it. We'll bring back our virtual instrument GUI. That it's also going to play these expansion pads. Now, if we just wanted to play the expansion pads, we wanted to resequence a groove and just use one-shot samples, we could just go ahead and simply power down these layers over here. Now, if I was to engage playback, it's obviously just using any MIDI information that I recorded or programmed in, and it will trigger that MIDI information based on the expansion kit samples that we're using and any settings that we have here. Just go ahead and set this back to the envelope view. Now I want to take a look at a slightly different mode, which essentially treats this information a little bit differently. And that is that if we were to disable the host mode over here, and let's go ahead, let's keep our layers powered down. You'll notice that it's still playing the MIDI information in terms of what we programmed. But even if I was to bring back these layers and power them back up, you'll notice that they're not playing. Okay, now there's a good reason for this, and that is simply because this pattern, or the full duration of this pattern, is now represented by a MIDI note. Now, they're kind of hard to make out in terms of detail. I think a good improvement here would be if they added these in a light blue color that helped them stand out. But now we have MIDI information for each one of these layers. So for example, We have C3, we have C#3, we don't need to worry about D3, and then we have D#3. So in order to hear this pattern or any duration of this pattern, we have to go ahead and we have to essentially program that MIDI information. So there's a couple different ways, obviously, that we can use this plugin. Let's go ahead. I'm just going to exit this for a second. Let's make a mental note that we need to program C3, C#3, and D#3. I'm going to go ahead and just close this plugin for a moment. And now we need to go down to our MIDI, and we need to make sure that we program this. So let me just go ahead. I'm just going to double click over here, and I can drag this out. And then we also know that we need a C#3. Just going to use some option drag modifiers so that I can get this information. And just to refresh my memory over here, I need C3, C#3, and D#3. Let's go ahead and close this again. And one more time, we're just going to option drag again. Now these, I can drag these all the way out to the very end over here. Now this will represent that pattern. So now if I was to go ahead and play this, now, the interesting thing about the way that this works is now if I was to go ahead and trim some of these back, you'll notice that it only played half of the pattern. Because now this MIDI event over here, or this MIDI note, is triggering this pattern. And this is based upon the duration. So for example, if I was to take this now, and I was to trim this back, let's trim this back to here, and let's play from the start. Now, one thing I might consider doing over here, just to kind of make this a little bit more easier to follow, let's go ahead and mute all of the additional MIDI information that we programmed, and let's just deal with these patterns. And let's go ahead and let's open up our instrument. Now keep your eye over here. You see that? Now this is the other thing. The minute these patterns are activated, you'll notice over here that the MIDI information over here in terms of the pitch that pertains to the layer is illuminated. So they're all in at bar 1, and then notice as we pass through, we are losing some of this information, and then they come back in. Now, the one thing to note about the way that this works is that this is going to start at the beginning of the section. So for example, if I come back here and I was to take this and I was to just shimmy this along and move this all the way to the end over here, when it comes in at bar 3, and let's pull this one all the way back, it's going to come in at the very beginning of the pattern based upon where the loop markers are set in Regroover Pro. So let's keep our eye on this GUI, and we're going to see that at the halfway point through this loop, we're going to see our hats become active. Now, another thing that we can do, obviously, is we can change the looping range of this, and now we're going to change the pattern altogether. So now when it comes in, it's going to come in with the 16th notes, those faster hi-hats. Now, one thing to note over here while we're talking about this is if we head up to the settings, and we're going to focus on this a little bit further on, but if we go into the settings over here, we can adjust some of the basic behaviors in terms of how the MIDI works. So for our expansion kit MIDI mode, you'll notice that this is set to trigger. Now for our layers MIDI mode, this is currently set to hold, but we can also set it to trigger or toggle. And we're going to focus on these in a little bit more detail later on. But essentially for this video, I just wanted to outline the differences in terms of the different ways that we can engage and trigger playback. So just to recap, we have a host mode over here, which will essentially play back the looping range that's set within Regroover Pro. And this is obviously based upon our MIDI markers that we have set per layer. In addition to that, it's also going to trigger any expansion kits if you've programmed the MIDI, such as we have up here, which is just this basic MIDI information that is triggering those different sounds. If we disengage host mode, then it's going to bypass the layers. And if we do want the layers to play in any way, shape, or form, we have to make sure that we go into our DAW and we actually have to program that MIDI information which is indicated by the MIDI notes that are indicated in this layer section over here. So our C3, C#3, D3, and D#3. So now that we have a really good understanding of how to program this, how to extract our layers, how to extract samples, and the different sync modes and different playback modes that we can engage, at this point, I want to talk about getting ready to incorporate Regroover Pro a little bit better into your project. And that could mean a couple things. It could mean that we just want to have a stereo instance, and maybe we need a little bit of protection in making sure that our levels don't get too hot. Or it could also mean that we want to split out or separate all of these individual layers and potentially all of these different expansion kits into different multi-outputs that are supported by our DAW, so that we can either record those onto separate layers or basically just have some control in our mixer or our console within our DAW, so that we can mix these individual elements and also add our own third-party EQs and compressors and plugins to the sound to start to get this to incorporate into our project better. So that's what we're going to focus on in the next video.